Good evening, Edmonton. Assalamu alaikum, merhaba, salam. It's wonderful to see all your beautiful, shining, mostly smiling faces. What I have to talk about this evening is will not, be so humorous. We're in very dark times. I come to you from a country you may have heard about. It's just to the south of Canada. It's a very small, peaceful, quiet little place that never interferes in the internal affairs of any other country. That country I call Trumpistan. So with Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, another stan is right near your border. It was mentioned that you could hear my program on the local campus community radio station. Actually, it's going to be on tomorrow, every Saturday morning from 11 to noon. And mention was made of my guru, my ustad, Noam Chomsky. I just interviewed him in Tucson, Arizona, and that will be broadcast tomorrow and next week as well, 2 parts. He's turning 91 years old, and he is still a symbol of intellectual integrity and someone, I'll give you a couple of Urdu Farsi words here so you'll know. Wherever there's zulm, wherever there is injustice, na-insafi, Chomsky is there to stand up for justice, stand up for the downtrodden. And I think that's what we need to do also as citizens of Canada or citizens of the United States or Pakistan or Iran, wherever you may call home. It's important that we stand up and fight and resist. As you can see, the rise up and resist. I hope you can all see. I know I'm very tall, so I'll come a little closer. Rise up and stop the Palestinization of Kashmir. So I'm going to be talking about Kashmir and Palestine and imperialism, which brings them together. Without an understanding of imperialism and how it works and why it works, we're pretty much kept in the dark. Before I continue, I should like to thank Dr. Safana Makhdoom, who's helped get me here, as well as all of the other members who have worked on bringing me to Edmonton after, it's been 7 or 8 years since I was last here. I go frequently to Vancouver. I was there last week interviewing Arundhati Roy. I go to Toronto quite a bit, but I haven't been back to Edmonton. So thank you so much for organizing it, because that's what it takes. It takes a few people, hard workers, making the phone calls, going on Facebook, making the connections, finding out about getting a hall, making a poster, telling friends. That's how movements begin. That's how social change happens. There was a very famous US anthropologist. Her name was Margaret Mead, M-E-A-D, and she said, throughout history, it's always been small groups of people that get together and act, and that's how change happens. So, we may see today in Lebanon, in Chile, in Bolivia, in Iraq, across the world, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in the streets protesting, demanding justice, demanding that their rights be protected. That all starts with a few people. It doesn't start with 100,000 or 200,000 in a room. It starts with one at a time. That's how change happens. When you connect with kindred spirits, as I call them. And that's why meetings like this are so important, not because I'm exceptional or anything like that. You see your neighbors, you see your friends. I'm going back to Trumpistan on Sunday, but you are here. So the work is for you to do, to connect, to get involved at whatever level you feel comfortable doing, but some kind of involvement. If it's simply writing a check, there's no shame in that. Our organizations need money. They have lots of money. the ruling elite, the powers in this country and in the US. So if that's what you can do, terrific. If you can join this organization and take part, also, that is very, very important. The whole goal of the ruling class is to keep us isolated, to keep us separated, to worry about, shopping in the mall, and is there a sale on this day, and should I buy this or that, and what kind of operating system should I add to my smartphone. Those kinds of weapons of mass distraction take us away from fighting Zoom, from fighting injustice, from fighting wrong things. So it's coming together is very, very important. And I'm going to hand out a sign-up sheet for alternative radio so I can keep in touch with you. There is a couple of provisos, though, I must say. There are a couple of people here old enough to remember penmanship. Laughter, right? A couple of people only. It used to be the art of writing clearly. I have to mention this because usually when I go back to Boulder after giving a talk, I can't read 3/4 of the email addresses. So just your name and an email, if you will. And don't worry, I'm not going to share this with CSIS or the RCMP because they already have all your information. You're very safe. So let me hand this out. All right, now for the matter at hand, as it were. November 29th, incidentally, marks the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people who have been living under occupation and Israeli state terror pretty much without stop since 1948. And this year, there's a specific boycott of HP that has been called for. That's Hewlett-Packard, which has a huge economic influence in Israel. And so you may want to look at that as 5,000 Palestinian political prisoners are in Israeli jails, hundreds of them held under administrative detention without charge or trial. Hewlett-Packard holds the current contract for maintenance of the Israeli prison system. So here's something not abstract, something very concrete that you can get involved in. And speaking of being held without charges, that has been the normal state of affairs in Indian-occupied Kashmir since 1947. Note the dates here. 1947, Kashmir. The next year, 1948, Palestine. Both of these unresolved issues resulting from imperial cartographers, map makers, coming and drawing lines in the sand or lines in the mountains, dividing different peoples who are actually, have, in the case of Kashmir, much in common. It's very important, as Chomsky reminds us, for institutions of concentrated power to keep people alone and isolated. That way you are ineffective. You can't defend yourselves. You can't figure out why things are happening as a single person. It's very difficult. So when you have community, when you have organizations, you have solidarity. And solidarity is really important because that gives you power. Power to fight the power and not to just worry about the various distractions of the Kardashians or who they are. I have to mention them. I happen to be Armenian, and my mother said, you should always mention something about Armenia in your talks. So, but they represent something really, I think, at once shallow and profound in US culture, that so much attention is given to such superficial people who happen to be extremely wealthy and who are making even more wealth at our expense when you buy their beauty products and hair conditioners and shampoos and all the other things that they sell. So we live in a culture, and I'm including Canada, of mass distractions. You know, how are the Oilers doing? Oh, I don't know. You think they'll win the Stanley Cup this year? Hey, look, how about those Toronto Blue Jays? Are they going to win the World Series? Always, you know, talking about things that are not really important, that are social distractions. So the point is to keep your eyes on the prize. What is that we are looking for? We are looking for justice, for rights for all people to live in peace and harmony and with dignity. Now, you may have heard that there's an orange-haired man who is sitting in the Oval Office, or is it the Oval Orifice, in Washington, D.C. You know, I'm a little slow. I don't quite remember his name, so I'll just refer to him as the orange-haired man. He said recently that the Middle East, and by that he means South Asia as well, is a very troubled place. And I have to agree with the orange-haired man. It is a very troubled place. But he does not go to the next step to ask the question, why is it a troubled place? What role does U.S. foreign policy have in the question of Palestine, in the question of Kashmir, in the situation threatening Iran with war, surrounding Iran with military bases and naval armadas and sending B-52s and more troops to the Middle East? Is this a way to solve a problem that you acknowledge exists? We should be sending diplomats. When I say we, I'm talking the United States, should be sending diplomats to West Asia and South Asia, not more troops. This is pouring gasoline on a fire that is growing and spreading more and more. Mahmoud Darwish, I'm going to go back and forth between West and South Asia. Mahmoud Darwish, the national poet of Palestine, also a very close friend of Professor Edward Said. He's, of course, written many, many poems. This one, "The Earth is Closing In on Us." Where should we go after the last frontiers? Where should the birds fly after the last sky? Where should the birds fly after the last sky? Where should the Kashmiris go? Where should the Palestinians go? You know, they say, well, in the case of the Palestinians, hey, there's 22 other Arab countries. They all speak Arabic. Most of them are Muslim. Why don't they go there? Well, how would you like it if someone came to you and said, well, you know, you're in Canada. You know, why don't you go to Australia? And they speak English. You know, they're mostly Christian there. They share your culture. Why don't you move to New Zealand? You might not feel very happy about those kinds of suggestions, because home is home. And it has, for people in the East, and for many of you here, you know, it has a huge emotional content to it. The music, the culture, the food, the smell, the architecture, all of those things are intangibles that cannot be easily replaced. How do I know this? I know it from my own personal experience. Almost my entire family was wiped out in 1915 in the first genocide of the 20th century by the Ottoman Turks. In my mother's family, 3 of my 4 grandparents were killed. My uncles all killed, aunts, cousins. In my mother's family alone, there were just 3 survivors out of 25. They somehow, the survivors, my mother met my father in Beirut in 1921, took a ship to Marseille, then a train to Cherbourg, and then a ship to New York, and that's where they settled, and that's where I was born in 1945. But they always spoke about Yergir. That's a word in Armenian that means Vatan, the homeland, home. And it was like a magical place. I remember growing up and, you know, hearing the old-timers who were born in Armenia talk about the water, the fruit, the air. It's so different. It was so much better. Those memories, that was so much a part of them. So I have that direct kind of knowledge about these very almost magical qualities that home represents. And they lived their lives here, the survivors of that genocide, but they always had one eye on their home, on their homeland, what they left behind. And it's really interesting. In 2005, I went to visit my mother's village, which is entirely Kurdish now, in north of Diyarbakir, which is a big Kurdish city in southeastern Anatolia. And I met all the villagers there, and I said, my mother comes from this village, and they welcomed me and gave me the most delicious apricots I have ever had in my life, absolute sugar. And I shared them with people on the bus going home. To go back to Dervish, when I first met Edward Said in New York, I attended his lecture, and then I went to him after the lecture and I said, I do this radio program, I'm a journalist, yada, yada, yada. Can I get in touch with you? And he said, sure, and he took down my telephone number. To my surprise, the next day he called me. Usually with famous people, you give them cards or they give you cards, and then bus, khalas, that's the last you hear from them. But in this case, he actually called me and he said, why don't you come up to Columbia, let's do an interview. I said, okay. So the next day I went, and I have to confess, I was pretty nervous. I was a little bit apprehensive because Said was quite a towering intellectual figure. And his command of English was breathtaking, I must say. I mean, his knowledge of English literature and culture also just simply quite extensive. So I was very much on edge, and when I walked in his office, he said, I hope you have some good questions for me. So you can imagine now how I felt, even worse, even more nervous. But he meant that in a positive way, in terms of don't ask me the same stupid questions that American journalists ask me all the time. Why are Muslims violent? What is it about the Quran that promotes bloodshed? Why are Muslims like this? And do you support terrorism? Are you for the killing of women and children? Those are the kinds of questions that he didn't want to hear from me. So I began actually with this Dervish poem, and that immediately opened him up. Because culture has a quality of reaching people's hearts, reaching their souls. So when some of you hear, the poetry of Shamlu or Hafiz or Sadi, to go back into Iranian poetic history, or Faiz Ahmed Faiz, or Jalid, or Iqbal, or any of the other great Urdu poets, you see what it captures in terms of the zeitgeist, in terms of the culture of a civilization and how important poetry is. So we began that with Mahmoud Darwish, and I talk about that in my first book with Said called The Pen and the Sword, and the second book I did with him is Culture and Resistance. Culture is very important in resistance. Yes, we need our facts, we need our history, all of those things, but we also need art. We need poetry, we need music, we need dance, we need theater, we need cinema, we need documentary films. If you want to have a glimpse into Iranian culture, for example, Iran, a relatively small country of 80 million people, has one of the great cinemas in the world. Way big. Nobody talks about Australian cinema or these other kinds of cinema, but Iran has an enormously influential and sophisticated cinema, and it tells you something about the society, about the culture. So we need art as well as politics, as well as the rhetoric and all of that, we shall overcome. We need to have those things because they give us life, they nurture us. Now, Kashmir, I'm jumping back now, it's in Urdu, it's always been called, and in Farsi also, Jannat-e-ben-Nazir, a heaven without equal. But I have changed that now in light of what is going on there to Jahannam-e-ben-Nazir, hell without equal, where 7 million people since August 5th have been in virtual lockdown with their under curfew, with arrests being made, people being picked up off the street, schools closed, internet access blocked, cell phone, mobiles blocked. Some of that is being restored. This does not come as a surprise to anyone who has been studying Kashmir, as I have, and I was last there in 2011. Unfortunately, after that I was banned from traveling to the world's largest democracy, India. That's what they like to call themselves. Because they have elections, people think it's a democracy. As someone commented, Hitler was elected also. Demagogues come to power, and one of the defining characteristics of this period that we're living in right now is that autocrats and totalitarians are using the ballot box, are using the tools of democracy to seize power, like Erdogan in Turkey, like Duterte in the Philippines, like Orban in Hungary, in country after country, Kaczynski in Poland, Putin in Russia, using the ballot box to come to power. This is a very kind of an interesting development. And the Kashmir issue has been going on since 1947, when the British, who controlled India then as one country, decided very quickly to leave South Asia, to leave the Indian subcontinent, and with great haste and with little foresight and thought, they created a largely Hindu majority India and a largely Muslim majority Pakistan. The results of this rash decision resulted in the deaths of perhaps 1 million people. 12 million people crossed the borders, Muslims from India going to Pakistan, Hindus and Sikhs from Pakistan going to the newly defined boundaries of India. But the scars of that remain until this day. I lived in India from 1966 to 1970, and in Delhi, okay, the other side, the Indian side, the Indian side of Punjab, and I met many Punjabis who, like the Armenians I just told you about, were talking about Vatan, about Desh, that's the Hindi word for country, how the water was so good there, how the naan tasted, how the roti was much better than the roti here, the bread. Everything is, in some ways romanticized. But I met a lot of those survivors, and they reminded me of the survivors I knew in my family from the Armenian genocide. People who had lost so much, but then moved to a new geography to begin life all over again. Silence is the loudest sound, Arundhati Roy, the great Indian writer, says, and Kashmir has no better friend than Arundhati Roy, who is from the southwestern Indian state of Kerala, by the way. She writes, the Indian government has confined about 7 million Kashmiris in their homes and imposed a complete communications blackout. This is an example of internal imperialism. So here the Indian state is not invading Nepal, it's not invading Malaysia. Within its own boundaries, there is imperialism. As I dare say, in North America, when the indigenous population was targeted for extermination, that was also a form of imperialism. That's why the United States is the United States today. That's why Canada is Canada today, because of the war on the people who were here and living in this country. India is now celebrating its 73rd year of independence. But the famous couplet of Jahangir, the Mughal emperor, who upon seeing Kashmir the first time said, Agar Janat, Berue Zaminas, Haminasto, Haminasto, Haminasto. Agar Berue Zaminas, Haminasto, Haminasto. If there is heaven on earth, it is Kashmir. If he were alive today, he would not recognize the torture and the pain that the Kashmiris are largely enduring under occupation. I don't know how many of you have ever been in a situation of occupation. It's not fun. It's not fun at all. There's no way to romanticize it. There's no way to gloss it over and say, well, it's not so bad. You know, I've got Netflix. I can see all the Game of Thrones reruns I want. I can do this. I can do that. I can buy these clothes. I can, go to basketball games in the Rogers Center in Toronto, etc. But to be stopped, to be questioned, to be humiliated, to be insulted, to have your dignity taken from you, it's a very unpleasant experience. I can tell you that. And so Kashmir has been under military occupation since 1947, since the British quit India and created Pakistan and India. Now, as I said, in quitting India, they left a lot of things unresolved. And Kashmir was the biggest of those unresolved issues. It was a Muslim majority state. There's no ambiguity about that. Overwhelming population was Muslim. But the Maharaja, the king, Hari Singh, was a Hindu. So he was delaying the accession to one of these two states. Lord Mountbatten, Dickey, as they used to call him, who was assassinated by the IRA in 1985. He was the last viceroy of India. And, Mountbatten wanted the Pakistanis and Indians to settle the question of Kashmir, but he put a tremendous amount of pressure, along with Nehru, who was the first prime minister of independent India, to basically to force Kashmir to go with India, even though the population wanted to go with Pakistan, for understandable cultural and religious reasons. But Nehru and Sardar Patel, who was again a high-ranking official in the Indian government in New Delhi, they put tremendous pressure on the Maharaja, Hari Singh, and he invited the Indian army to go into Kashmir. And there was fighting. That was the first war about Kashmir, and there was a ceasefire line drawn in 1949. That remains today. That's called the Line of Control, LOC. Pakistan has about 1/3 of Kashmir. India has about 2/3, and a sliver of Kashmir is controlled by China. It's called Aksai Chin, right along the Tibetan northern part of Kashmir. So it's a divided area, and at the time, Nehru, who has this incredible reputation here in the West, in Europe, and in the United States and Canada, I'm sure as well, as a great statesman and a wonderful writer. His book, Discovery of India, was, highly praised and the like. He happened to be of Kashmiri origin. Now, we don't know if this jaundiced his views of Kashmir, but some scholars have suggested that because he was of Kashmiri origin, he was biased in keeping Kashmir as part of India. But nevertheless, besides his being Kashmiri, he made a number of public statements which said that we will abide by the wishes of the Kashmiri people. If they want to, we will have a plebiscite. I can read you these quotes. We have declared that the fate of Kashmir is ultimately to be decided by the people. The pledge we have given not only to the people of Kashmir and to the world, we will not and cannot back out of it. I have repeatedly said that as soon as peace and order have been established, Kashmir should decide accession by plebiscite or referendum under international auspices such as those under the United Nations. And it's quote after quote, 1948, 1949, 1950. And then by the early 1950s, there's a significant shift in policy from New Delhi. Nehru decides we're going to keep Kashmir. There's not going to be a plebiscite. There's not going to be a vote. There's not going to be any kind of democratic choosing for the Kashmiris. And so there you had the incorporation of Kashmir into the Indian Union. And crucially at that time, there were two parts of the Constitution that were amended dealing with Kashmir. That is Article 370, which you may have heard about in the very paltry and pathetic news coverage of what's happened in Kashmir in the last 4 or 5 months. Article 370 of the Indian Constitution gives Kashmir and Kashmiri people a degree of autonomy that they can decide certain issues on their own. They don't have to wait for New Delhi to decide for them. So they had some political autonomy. And then another very critical aspect of this Constitution was Article 35A. This has also been eliminated now, nullified, null and void. And that would not allow for non-Kashmiris to come into Kashmir and to buy land. So it would keep the ethnic and cultural content of the Kashmiris intact. And for those of you who don't know, Kashmiris linguistically, culturally, even music, are very distinct from other groups in South Asia. There's connections with Iran, for example, that don't exist in other parts of South Asia. And so not keeping this now allows for the West Bankization of Kashmir. That is to say, settler colonialism. It is now possible for Indians, they can be Hindu or Christian or Muslim or whatever, to come in and buy land and settle in Kashmir. That is viewed with great anxiety and trepidation by the Kashmiris, who are around 7 million, overwhelmingly Muslim. There are still some Hindus living, and Sikhs as well. I don't say Sikh because that's a mispronunciation that the corporate media keeps using over and over again. So you know and since you have a large community here, you know it's Sikh. Yeah, like the way they say Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and all the other mispronounced words coming from the mouths of these million-dollar anchors who compete for the best hair on the air. And you have them here in Canada as well. You know who I'm talking about better than I. So occupation, force, has been the mechanism of control. Just as the Israelis control the Palestinians, how? By love? By affection? By kindness? No, by force. When you have a gun, you use it. States have guns, and they're using it to control the population, be it in Kashmir, be it in Xinjiang, where Muslims are being persecuted by China. It's very interesting right now. There's quite a bit of, Islamophobia is extensive, not just in this country, but to your neighbor in the south, all over the world. Mosques are being attacked, New Zealand and elsewhere. And why, why this is happening at this particular time, you see the Rohingya in Myanmar, they happen to be a Muslim minority under attack. Where is the international community, so-called, on these particular issues, on what's happening to the Muslims in Myanmar, who have a prime minister, by the way, who's worshipped by the Anglosphere, as this great woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize, Aung San Suu Kyi. There's now genocide charges being brought against her and the regime in Myanmar. But you see in China, in the West Bank, in Kashmir, in Myanmar, Muslims under attack. Is it a coincidence? I don't think so. I think it's part of the larger Islamophobia that has been manipulated by political leaders who outrageously call themselves populists. There's nothing populist about them. They're tyrants, they're autocrats, and they want to maximize their power. And they have control, as one Marxist scholar said, the main means of control, which is a monopoly on violence. States have a monopoly on violence, but you see people pushing back. Look what happened. You never know how things can change or when they will change. Now, Tunisia, let me give you an example. In 2010, was in the 23rd year of a dictatorship of Ben Ali. He looked invincible. He looked impregnable. He looked like he would be ruling that country for another 23 years. So what happens in a small town in the south of Tunisia called Bouaziz? A poor street vendor selling vegetables and fruit is humiliated and insulted by a policewoman who's demanding a bribe. He refused to pay. He went to the government offices. He was completely ignored. No one would see him. He poured gasoline on himself and committed suicide. His name was Mohammed Bouazizi. Very few people in this audience have ever heard him. But because of this one action, it was the catalyst to a revolution that no one was expecting. Totally by surprise, the Tunisian people, within 3 weeks, not 3 months or 3 years, within 3 weeks overthrew the Ben Ali dictatorship. The same thing happened, and his name was Mohammed Bouazizi, because he was from the town of Bouaziz. And he is remembered today, and Tunisia today has elections, has some form of democratic governance. That spread, of course, then to Egypt, where Mubarak was toppled. Again, he looked invincible. He was the longest running ruler since Ramses II, the pharaoh. And no one could imagine, how could Mubarak fall? When people organize and demand justice, they have power. As individuals, it's not much, there's not much impact we can have. It's when you have allies, when you have, your friends to watch your back, that you can make another world is possible, as Arundhati Roy likes to say. And we have to imagine it, whether it's in Pakistan, whether it's in India, whether it's in Iran, whether it's in the United States, where we need regime change like maybe no other country on the face of the earth today. And to tell you a little bit about the United States, I'm going to read you something. This is true. On Tuesday, August 20th at 8 a.m., the FBI came to my door. Agents Carlos Medina and Brian Palmer. They wanted to know about my trip to Iran and whether I knew certain people. They wanted me to share, that was their word, share my experiences in Iran. We're interested in your story, they said in a very friendly way. Why? Because the Iranian government targets naive Americans and manipulates them. The implication is that I'm a naive American and I'm being manipulated. I told them I regarded their visit as a form of harassment. I'm a journalist, I'm doing my job, I travel to lots of countries all over the world. Why are you just interested in Iran? I went to Jordan and you didn't ask me any questions. I went to Syria, I went to Lebanon, I went to Turkey, I went to Egypt, you didn't ask any questions. Why Iran? Well, Iran is, there's Iranophobia in the US, largely because of the orange-haired man and his hysterical attacks on the Islamic Republic. Anyway, they left after about 10 minutes. I didn't let them in the house, but it was enough to scare my wife, Kadriye. Initially, she thought they were Jehovah's Witnesses. I said, you know who they are. Just maybe a couple of people might not know. These are very conservative Christians who go and knock on people's doors and give them literature about their particular brand of Christianity. Maybe you have them here in Canada? Yeah. And they're dressed like that, two young men, very short hair, tie up here, very stiff, yes ma'am, no ma'am, yes thank you ma'am, yes ma'am, this kind of thing. But then, so she thought they were Jehovah's Witnesses, but then when she found out that they were the FBI and she's from Turkey, she knows something about state authorities knocking on doors, at 8 o'clock in the morning or at 8 o'clock at night or 3 o'clock at night, because she was part of the opposition in Turkey. So John Trudell, who was a great American Indian activist and a poet and a writer, he called the FBI the Federal Bureau of Intimidation. Now, I think, it's good to have these kinds of agencies in the United States and in Canada, but they should be investigating white supremacists. They should be investigating Islamophobes. They should be investigating these people that walk into supermarkets and schools and open fire and killing innocent people. That's the job that they should be doing, rather than interviewing journalists who go to another country to do, to find out information about what's going on in that particular country. Anyway, I'm more energized than ever before, if you can't tell that, I'm not intimidated by the Federal Bureau of Intimidation. James Baldwin was a great African-American novelist and activist, and he wrote this to Angela Davis. Angela Davis is also, I think, one of our great heroes in the resistance movement. She was on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list in the early 1970s. And James Baldwin wrote to her and said, if they take you in the morning, that means they'll be coming for us at night. So we have to stand up to power. We cannot be neutral. We cannot say, well, I'll get around to it. Let me think about it. I'm kind of busy. I got so many problems. I'm working 2 jobs. I can't pay my kids' tuition to school. My mother has, looks like she has cancer. I'm worried about her. I don't have a medical insurance in the United States. The drugs are very expensive, and on and on. And yes, and we have all of these things. We live in this body, as they say in Hindi, "Char din ki zindagi phir andheri raat." We're here for 4 days only, a very short time, and then we're gone. We're no longer part of this earth, And so what do we do in this short time that we are here, present on this planet, this pale blue dot in the universe, as Carl Sagan called planet Earth, which is, by the way, under assault right now. That's not my topic tonight, but I have to mention that the climate crisis is extremely serious and poses grave threats, not to Iranians, not to Americans, not to Canadians, but to every single human being on this earth. All 7 billion people are under threat. And by the way, excuse me for saying this, you happen to live in a province that is contributing enormously to climate chaos. I don't have to tell you what's going on north of Fort McMurray. Or, by the way, what the pipeline, the TMX pipeline, I was in Vancouver last week. There's a lot of actions to block the TMX from going through British Columbia, because that's more of this, I don't call it oil sands, that's propaganda, tar sands. The filthiest oil on earth is what James Hansen calls it. And if it's released from the ground, he said, this is the famous scientist, he said the game's over. basically, for humankind. I mean, we'll live maybe another 50, 100, 150 years, but there'll be a steady decline in the quality of life. So that's a pretty serious thing. And I don't give any talks without mentioning what is happening, the attack on the earth, in which Canada, this, excuse me again for saying, relatively small country of less than 40 million people, Canada has 75% of the world mining headquarters in this country. Wherever I go, if it's in Latin America, South Asia, I was in Armenia a couple of years ago, I find out about these environmental catastrophes. And almost every single one of them is linked to a Canadian mining company. Human rights abuses, unfair labor practices, and the like. So Canada, which, again, a very, relatively speaking, a small country, has a huge impact on the environment. And it's something, you need to work. You don't need Americans like me to lecture you about it. That's for you to do here in this country and find out, what's going on in Tanzania, in Papua New Guinea, wherever these Canadian mining companies are going, there's enormous human rights violations. So, end of that particular speech. This is the 100th anniversary of Joseph Schumpeter, a name you will not recognize. He was an Austrian sociologist, and he's best known for a book he wrote called The Sociology of Imperialism. You remember I said at the beginning, to understand Kashmir, to understand the West Bank, Palestine, what's going on there, you have to understand imperialism. This is what he wrote. And every time you hear the word Rome or Roman, you can just put in United States or America and see if there's some resonance. There was no corner of the world where some interest was not alleged to be in danger or under actual attack. If the interests were not Roman, they were of Rome's allies. And if Rome had no allies, then they would be invented. When it was utterly impossible to contrive such an interest, why then it was the national honor that was insulted. The fight was always invested with an aura of legality. Rome was always being attacked by evil-minded neighbors. The whole world was pervaded by a host of enemies, and it was Rome's duty to guard against them. So it is in the duty, in the viewpoint of Washington, when they send aircraft carrier battle groups, in the Persian Gulf, off the Gulf of Somalia. That is all about projecting power and trying to intimidate people to bend, to kiss the hand of the master, to be a vassal, to be a colony, to do what Saudi Arabia is doing, buy American weapons, buy British weapons, and then bomb the hell out of Yemen and civilians in Yemen. These are the kinds of things, the kind of outcomes that imperialism generates. India itself is an imperialist country. Not that it's attacking outside, it's attacking inside, in Kashmir, in Assam, in Nagaland, in Mizoram, in Chhattisgarh, in Jharkhand. In all of these places I have just named, there are major insurrections, rebellions against the Indian state. And they're being controlled by the Indian military, which is huge. In Kashmir alone, it's the most densely militarized zone on earth, much more than anywhere else in West Asia. There are about 700,000 Indian troops in this small valley. And I've been there on multiple occasions. I remember the last time I was there with Khurram Parvez, who's a real hero that everybody should know about. That Justin Trudeau, also known as Justin Bieber. You have two Justins here, right? He should invite Khurram Parvez to Ottawa and honor him as someone who is fighting for the dignity of the Kashmiri people in a non-violent way, talking about, the rights of Kashmiris to self-determination, because that ultimately is what this is about. Do Kashmiris have the right that every other country claims it has? That is the right of self-determination. Do Palestinians have the right of self-determination? It's a yes or no question. It's not, you don't have to be a PhD in history or political science to under these things. All people under the UN Charter and moral law, if I can say, have the right of self-determination. When you deny people that right, you have rebellion, you have revolution, you have uprisings. And that's what's going on in Kashmir and in those other parts of India that I mentioned. I was with Khurram Pervez. We were traveling around the Kashmir Valley. There are 8,000 to 10,000 unmarked graves in Kashmir. People who have disappeared, who go into these state security detention centers and are never heard from again. This is particularly painful for the mothers and the wives and the sisters and the daughters of these people who are missing. They don't know where to, one woman, they don't know where to bring the flowers and put them there and to have a namaz, have a prayer. They don't have that closing. Maybe he's still alive. Who knows? Where is he? We don't know. I never heard this expression before in English, custodial deaths. I learned this expression in Kashmir. What does it mean? It means when the state security forces arrest you, you then suddenly disappear. You become a custodial death. These are usually triggered by another South Asian word that I learned in English when I was there, called encounters. Encounters are police or military actions where people are killed, and then mysteriously the people who are killed, they find documents on them, signed by Osama bin Laden, kill as many Hindus as you can, or Zarqawi or Baghdadi or whoever the enemy du jour happens to be, and say, I'm an agent of Zarqawi and Baghdadi and I want to kill everybody, particularly women and children. I'm a bloodthirsty. So they find these documents on these Kashmiris. These are extrajudicial assassinations. They're straight out executions. There's no other word to describe them. There's no due process. There's no evidence. There's no law. There's no jury. That's what you have happening in a military-like situation. So going around the Kashmir Valley, when with Khurram, my friend Khurram Pervez, whenever we came across an Indian military convoy, you had to pull over to the side of the road and stop and turn off your engine. If not, you could be shot. So we had to do that. We had to pull over to the side and turn off the engine and just sit there and endure insults from the Indian troops, praising Hindu gods, Jai Shri Ram, Jai Bhavani, praising Hindu gods, which most Muslims would find offensive, and understandably so. And you see this all over the valley of Kashmir, the army bases, the camps. They have Hindu iconography, Hindu symbols, Lord Shiva, Ganesh, the trident, and all of these other aspects of the Hindu religion. So overwhelmingly, the occupation troops are not only Hindu, but they're not from Kashmir. So they don't speak Urdu, they don't speak Kashmiri, they can't communicate with the people. They come from other parts of India, and this is what I meant by internal colonialism, internal imperialism. They are brought and then thrown into Kashmir, and they have no idea what's going on. Why are these people angry with us? Why is there so many attacks on our police stations and our military camps? The whole valley of Kashmir is dotted with detention centers and torture centers as well. 80,000 people have been killed. 80,000. You think this would be something that would attract the media attention of the West? But there's very little reporting on Kashmir, and there's very little substantive reporting on the West Bank. Why? That's because of propaganda. That's because of a systematic campaign starting in New Delhi in terms of projecting to the world that India is the land of Buddha. It is the land of Gandhi. Everyone is a vegetarian. They are all meditating and doing yoga and living in ashrams and are very peaceful, loving people. That's the image. And they have been very successful in cementing that image in the minds of many, many people in Europe and in North America. And propaganda, by that I mean constant, incessant repetition over and over again. Full-page ads in our leading newspaper, maybe in the Globe and Mail International in Canada, I don't know, from the Indian Tourist Bureau. Visit Kashmir, go skiing in Kashmir. The people will love you, welcome, welcome, that kind of thing. There's an interesting film, I hope you get to see. It's called Jashan-e-Azadi, the celebration of freedom. It's done by a Kashmiri filmmaker friend of mine. His name is Sanjay Kak, K-A-K. The opening scene is of Indian Hindu tourists in Kashmir who are going skiing and having, and snow is unusual in South Asia, so this is a very extraordinary thing to happen. And they're going skiing, and the Kashmiris are like their servants, taking them around to make sure that they don't fall. You see that colonial relationship and how power is projected. And in the same respect that India has won the propaganda war on Kashmir, largely Israel has won the propaganda war vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Who speaks for the Palestinians? These corrupt regimes in the region? Now, in fact, they don't even speak for them. They're collaborating with the Israelis. I'm talking about the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Emiratis. You may think twice about flying Emirati Airways the next time you travel. They have all turned on their so-called Palestinian brothers because they have seen the light of Tel Aviv and Washington and where it will lead them to greater accumulation of wealth. The Israeli narrative, this is something Edward Said talked about all the time. If you control the narrative, you control the discussion, you dominate the other person. You're using my terminology, you're using my vocabulary, you're using my frame of reference. I have basically won. What is the Israeli line that is repeated over and over again? We want peace. We are a peace-loving people. We are surrounded by enemies. They want to kill us. They want to throw us in the sea. There is only one Jewish state. We are here. We want freedom. We want to live in peace. That's repeated over and over again. It has an effect. We have this great leader in Washington today. According to the Washington Post, as of yesterday, he has told 13,000 lies in the first 3 years of his presidency. That's pretty impressive. I mean, you'd have to work overtime to generate that many lies. So you have to say, chapeau bas to him. Hats off. He's really working hard. And then that sows seeds of doubt in your mind. 2 and 2 is 4, but then I saw someone said it was 5, and there was a television program that said it's 4. I'm really confused, and the radio said it was 5. What's going on here? That's when they won. And it doesn't matter about the truth of things. Goebbels was Hitler's propaganda minister. He said, the main thing is they're talking about us. It doesn't matter even if it's negative. He said this in 1928, 1929, when the Nazi Party was just growing in Germany. They only got 2% of the vote in 1928. By 1932, they got 40% of the vote. So they welcomed negative publicity. The way people say, terrible things about the President of the United States, he welcomes that. That plays into his hands. It's like walking into a trap. You're talking about me. I am the center of attention. And that is my universe. Because I am a narcissistic megalomaniac. I want everything on me, even if it's negative. So Goebbels welcomed those attacks on the Nazis in the 1927, 1928. They were saying, no one takes them seriously. These are crazy people. They're fanatics. Germany is the greatest civilization Europe has ever seen. You know, we have the literature of Thomas Mann, the architecture of the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius, all, you know, Kurt Weill, music, Lotte Lenya music, Bertolt Brecht poetry. Germany was an incredibly developed country. 75% of all scientific papers in the 1920s were written in German. Not English, not French, German. German was the language of science. Very advanced. How could that happen within a few short years? It descends into a barbarism rarely seen in human history. So I'm not saying that that's happening in the US right now, but there are signs of that. And we have to be very vigilant and careful about, you know, what is going on in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Why is the US so interested in the Middle East? Is it because they love Iranian culture and the poetry of Fardousi? I don't think so. Is it because they love, you know, well, I should say, you know, they love Arab culture? No. It's about oil. It's always been about resources. And Iran has huge natural resources in oil and natural gas, as does many of the surrounding countries. In 1945, before World War II ended, the US already identified the Middle East as the center of their imperial project. The US emerges from the war in a position of power, economic, military, political power, probably unprecedented in the history of the world. 50% of the global economy was based in the United States. It's hard to believe that today, but 50%. And how were they going to keep control and extend that domination? Through the control of oil, which the State Department called a stupendous source of strategic power, one of the greatest material prizes in world history, probably the richest economic prize in the field of foreign investment, the most strategically important area of the world, a vital prize for any power interested in world domination. They were saying it straight out to the people of the world. We're going to control the oil. We're going to resist any independent nationalism. So Mohammad Mossadegh, you don't raise your finger against the United States. We will destroy you. As the US did in 1953, when a popularly democratic, small d, a liberal progressive prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown in a coup d'etat. This is old history for Iranians. Of course, Operation Ajax. This is MI6, British intelligence, with the Central Intelligence Agency of the US overthrowing Mohammad Mossadegh. What was Mossadegh's crime? What was his crime? Independent nationalism. Washington cannot allow that. You must kiss my hand. You must bow down to me. You look at me when I tell you you can look at me. Otherwise you look down. And Mossadegh had a very funny idea. What was his funny idea? The resources of Iran should benefit the Iranian people. What? You mean they're not supposed to benefit the British oil companies, Shell and British Petroleum, or the other giants? That was his crime. The benefit should benefit the people. And in country after country, wherever there was a democratic movement, the US moved in to make sure that they had a whole panoply of shahs and emirs and kings and monarchs and all of these feudal rulers, many of whom are still in power today. It's hard to believe we're almost in 2020 and we still have emirs in the Gulf, you know, ruling these countries. So what's happening then, of course, in Palestine could happen in Kashmir. There could be a movement of, this is settler colonialism, what happened in South Africa, what happened in Canada, what happened in the United States. These are all examples of settler colonialism. Peoples from outside come in and displace the people who are already there, in most instances, wiping them out. As you know, the Aboriginal population in Australia, the Maoris in New Zealand, coming under a tremendous attack. That is, that's certainly a possibility. But I think the Indian state under Narendra Modi, he's a Hindu nationalist fascist, he has overstepped and he has opened up a can of worms now. Have you ever tried to put toothpaste back into the tube once it's out? Very difficult. He has opened up now a can of worms that he will not be able to close. I think what he did in abrogating those two clauses of the Indian Constitution, in essentially annexing Jammu and Kashmir to be ruled by Delhi as a union territory. It's no longer an independent state. It will be ruled from Delhi like a colony. They should call it straight out. It will be a colonial type of situation. How are we doing? Not too bored? You okay? All right, because you always have to check in with the audience to see if, because I tend to talk a lot. I'm a double Gemini. If that means anything to anybody who knows anything about astrology. If not, forget I just said that. But they tend to be talkative, loquacious. And we look at this, so as I said, Modi has opened up a can of worms. There will be rebellion in Kashmir from now into the future. It will ebb and flow. Right now they're under the gun. There's tremendous pressure on them. But no doubt there will be more uprisings in the future. So the game is not over. And one of Edward Said's favorite phrases was from Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian theoretician and philosopher. He died in Mussolini's jails in 1937. He said, "Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will." This was also Iqbal Ahmed and Noam Chomsky's also favorite quotation. What did Gramsci mean by that? You look at the situation, you look at Kashmir today, you look at Palestine, it's grim. There's no other way to describe it. You can't say, the sun will rise tomorrow, things will change, it'll be great, everything's terrific. That would betray the intellectual reality. So you see what's there. You don't lapse into conspiracy theories and magical thinking. There'll be some miracle and, Modi will change his ways and he'll see the injustices being done to the Kashmiris and he'll give them some kind of autonomy. That's not going to happen. So the second part of that is optimism of the will. So we look at the situation, it's serious, very serious. But we have an optimism that we can change things. And no one knows how this change can happen. As I said, gave you the example of Mohammed Bouazizi. No one could say that a poor fruit and vegetable vendor in southern Tunisia, his suicide would lead to a revolution and the overthrow of a dictatorship. No one would ever say that. Look what happened in the Republic of Armenia in 2018, by the way. As I told you, I happen to be Armenian. I was there in 2017. I met a lot of people. They were very unhappy with the government, particularly young people. They said, there's no future here. They've sold the country to Canadian mining companies. That's where I heard a lot about Canada. They've sold the country to the Russians. They have lots of investments in Armenia. And what happens? A 26-year-old woman, software designer, her name is Armine Hagopian. She has one child. She said, something clicked in my brain one day. And she said, we don't need to tolerate this situation. And you know that almost, without exception, every single post-colonial Soviet state lapsed into oligarchy. Without exception. That was the legacy of the USSR. to Kazakhstan, to Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, every single Soviet republic, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, became corrupt oligarchies. So the comrades, these hypocrites, they just changed their clothes. They remained the same power-hungry, greedy bureaucrats. So a very obscure politician in Armenia, his name is Nikol Pashinyan, he said, he was a member of parliament, but from a small party, nobody knew much about him. He said, I'm going to walk across Armenia, small country, landlocked between Iran and Turkey. Those are the two big neighbors. And I'm going to be inspired by Gandhi. In 1930, Gandhi walked to the Indian Ocean to make salt because the British had put a tax on salt. And Gandhi said, we're not going to pay this tax. We can make it ourselves for free, here, and I will show you how. So you may have seen the movie by Richard Attenborough, Gandhi.
Yes.
Yes, Ben Kingsley plays Gandhi, and they show this thing. It's very impressive. You know, he starts off in one village, there's 10 people with him, then the next village, 100 people join him. And Pashinyan, the same thing happened. Came 100,000, 10,000, 100,000, hundreds of thousands of people reached the capital city of Yerevan and completely paralyzed the government, shut it down. The airport was shut down, the bus station, the train station, the metro, the ministers could not get out of their houses. They were completely surrounded by people. And the unthinkable happened. This oligarchy just collapsed with no violence. It's another interesting thing. There had been an uprising in 2008, and some people were killed because the security forces got very nervous and opened fire on the demonstrators. In this instance, there were no casualties whatsoever. So change can happen. You never know what it will be. And it could be like Armine Hagopian, something just clicks in your ear, in your mind, and then you find other people, kindred spirits, who feel the same way. I don't have to take this anymore. We don't have to stand for this corruption. We want to stand for freedom. So today, Armenia is in better shape than it was. I'm not saying it's a perfect state. There are no perfect states. All states have problems. That's what it's about. It's about overcoming those problems, ameliorating them. But it's a much better situation than it was during the oligarchy. So pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will that things can change. One last thing I want to say about Palestine. We have something very unusual in the United States. It's called PEP. I don't know if you have this practice here in Canada. It stands for Progressive Except Palestine. So in the U.S., we have these, well-meaning liberals who want, the rule of law, human rights, protection of women, equal economic opportunities, and all of these things, Security Council resolutions, UN General Assembly votes, all of those things. But when it comes to Palestine, nothing, not a word. And that's because, again, propaganda. Israel is surrounded by enemies. They want to crush. The reality is Israel has nuclear weapons. Iran and other Middle Eastern countries for years has been calling that the Middle East, West Asia, be a nuclear weapons of mass destruction free zone. People, when I mention this in the U.S., blank faces. Nobody has even heard of this. I think it was Egypt, actually, that first proposed that the region not have nuclear weapons. But that can't happen because Israel has nuclear weapons, has ballistic missiles, but is not part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So India, Pakistan, and Israel all have nuclear weapons, are not signatories to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran, which does not have weapons, is subjected to the utmost scrutiny from the international community. So PEP, Progressive Except Palestine, all of these people, all of our liberal politicians have great difficulty in talking about, what is going on. Leonard Cohen was one of your great poets and musicians. He died a couple of years ago. I hope you know about him. In fact, the Canadian government just issued some postage stamps with Leonard Cohen, and his most famous couplet, which I'm going to read to you, it's called Anthem. Ring the bells that can still ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So as activists, as politically engaged people, as fighters for human rights and dignity, we have to find those cracks, those spaces, and make them wider, bring in more people, and grow the circle of resistance. That's how change happens. So you should listen to Leonard Cohen, great poet. So we are. Let me give you a couple of jump back to South Asia. This current period of Hindu nationalism really comes to fruition on December 6, 1992. What happened then? The Babri Masjid, which was a mosque built by the Emperor Babur, who came from Central Asia, by the way, from Farghana, which is now in, I believe, in Afghanistan. He built this mosque, and the Hindus claim that the Lord Ram that they worshipped was buried at the same site. So there was a lot of agitation around this mosque. The Hindu nationalists say, we want to destroy the mosque and build a temple to our god Ram, right? So on December 6th, because of right-wing Hindu fundamentalist agitation, the mosque is completely demolished. That led to what are called, unfortunately, riots. I think pogroms is a better description, because if you have 100 people from one community being killed and one from the other community, that's not a riot, that's a massacre when you have that kind of disproportionate killing. So thousands of Muslims were killed, incidentally, in the most cosmopolitan city in India, Bombay, Mumbai. Huge number of people killed, and there have been, India, since its independence in 1980, has conducted a number of massacres against its minority communities. In 1984, the Sikhs from Punjab, after Indira Gandhi was assassinated, her two bodyguards happened to be Sikh. The wrath of the Hindu nationalists turned on the Sikh community, and thousands of them were slaughtered. Many of them in the capital, right under the noses of the liberal prime minister and the parliament of India. The year before that, there were massacres of Muslims in Assam, in the northeast, the Nellie massacre. Thousands of people killed. In none of these cases, by the way, is there any justice. There are no trials, no one is accused, there's no evidence is presented. Everything is, put under the carpet as they ready themselves for the next atrocity. So after 1992, you have then the rise of the Hindu right, which has its origins in fascism, in European fascism, specifically Mussolini. The RSS, which in Hindi is the Rashtriya Sevak Sangh, the Hindu nationalist organization. It's part of the BJP. In fact, it is the mothership of the ruling political party. So the BJP, which controls India today, that's Modi's party, Bharatiya Janata Party, Indian People's Party. They use the word party. That is ruling the country. Now, they took their inspiration from Italian fascism and Hitler fascism and Franco-fascism in Europe. And they grew as a political organization. They come to power in India, first in 2014, then again in May of this year. And they play the Muslim card. They play the Kashmiri card. They scare people. The Muslims are coming. They're going to rape, just like in the United States, there's all of this racism against black. It all has to do, most of it, under the current has to do with sexuality. You know, our women are going to be raped. We won't be safe. They're going to come into our homes and steal our children. So, you know, it reverts back to fears of sexual violation, to manipulate people, because, as I told someone you know, earlier today, when you are afraid, it's difficult to think rationally. You know, if you're on pins and needles, if you're worried about who's in that room, or should I open this door? Who's behind the door? Who's under the table? If you're in that state of mind, I can totally manipulate you. I can totally control you. I can tell you, you know, your enemy, it's that sick guy over there. Why is he wearing a turban? What's behind that turban? You know, he wants to rape your daughter. That's how you can manipulate people. Scapegoating, that's what you see happening in the United States of America today. The scapegoating of minorities who are the most vulnerable, who cannot fight back. That's precisely why they are scapegoated. That's why they're targeted, because they are powerless. This is, you know, exactly, we've seen this throughout how history repeats itself. You know, and there's that famous Spanish philosopher, George Santayana. Those who forget the past are condemned to relive it. We forget the past over and over again. And so we see how the mobs are mobilized, how mobs are manipulated. So you have perfectly ordinary, and you would think reasonable, and you probably, all of you have US friends and you travel to the US, very reasonable people. You know, all of a sudden, saying, you know, death to Muslims, you know, drain the swamp, lock her up, build the wall, propaganda, you know, like nothing we've seen in the US. Palestine, the situation in Palestine is maintained not only by force, but by internal colonization. That is to say, people who are living under the boot. When you have a boot on your neck, as Orwell said, you have very little ability to move around. You want to get that boot off your neck. And so there's a danger of making compromises. And every occupation requires people who collaborate. Frantz Fanon wrote about this in Wretched of the Earth. You should know that book. Okay, I'm getting a signal for time. So military occupation, it happens in Palestine, it happens in Kashmir, it happens when the US invades and occupies Iraq, when it invades and bombs Libya and Somalia and Yemen and Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the whole list of countries that come under Washington's gaze. I'm going to close with, if I can find this, yes, a little bit of poetry, because I talked about poetry. The greatest Urdu poet of the 20th century in Pakistan was Faiz Ahmed Faiz. He was born in Sialkot in 1911. He died in 1984. His most famous poem is called Bol, B-O-L. So now you know, the non-Urdu Hindi speakers here, you know a word in Hindi and Urdu. It's the imperative, speak. Diga in Spanish, speak. So I would go to demonstrations, not in Pakistan, but in India, and there would be signs, Bol. Everybody knew what that meant. Everybody knew what this poem was about. And Faiz was someone who fought for human rights, for dignity. He was thrown into jail multiple times by the US-backed dictators in Pakistan, like Ayub Khan and Yahya Khan and Zia and all the others. But he was also, you know, a great resistance fighter. Bol, bol ke lab azad hai tere, bol zaban ab tak teri hai. Speak, your lips are free. Speak, your tongue is still yours. This magnificent body is still yours. Speak, your life is still yours. Speak, there's little time. Though there is, it is enough time. Enough before the body perishes, before the tongue atrophies. Speak, the truth still lives. Say what you have to say. Speak, your lips are free. Bol, bol, bol. Faiz. And you know, there's also that great, another great poem. I don't have it in front of me, but I'll kind of improvise. Hum dekenge. some of you know that. Iqbal Bano was a great Pakistani singer. She made this song, very well known. It means we will see. Hum dekenge, we will see. So we will, this is Fayez's most optimistic poem, by the way. We will see the day when those who are sitting on the thrones, their power will go up like cotton balls in the wind, and people in the streets will have justice. Hum dekenge, we will see that day. It's a great poem. I recommend that you hear it. And finally, I'm going to close with someone from the US radical tradition. His name is Frederick Douglass. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Our great leader in Washington believes Douglass is still alive. A couple of years ago, he praised him. We have something in the US called African American History Month. It's the shortest month of the year, by the way. Angela Davis likes to say, you know, even here we got the shaft. Why didn't they give us 31 days like May or some other month? No, we get 28 days. So the great leader's going on and on, you know. Frederick Douglass is doing great work. People really admire him. And no one said, you know, this guy died 150 years ago. Wake up, Mr. President. But that's the kind of insanity. When the lunatics are controlling, when the doctors in the lunatic asylum, you know, are insane, then we're in real trouble. And that's the kind of situation, you know, we have today in the US. But this is what Frederick Douglass really said many years ago. If there's no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom, yet deprecate agitation, are men and women who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without its mighty waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. So if you're waiting for the other Justin, not Bieber, you know, to wake up one day in Ottawa and say, you know, I'm going to solve all the problems in Canada overnight, it's only going to happen because people here rise up and demand change and justice. Thank you very much.